Project MK Ultra. Imagine discovering that your own mind had become someone else's experiment without your knowledge. That was the terrifying reality behind Project MK Ultra, one of the most infamous secret programs ever created by the CIA. Beginning in the early years of the Cold War, officials feared rival nations had discovered ways to control human minds. Their answer was to secretly test drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation on thousands of people. Many participants never gave informed consent. Some believed they were simply volunteering for medical research, while others had no idea they were even part of an experiment. LSD became one of the program's favorite tools because researchers hoped it could erase memories, force confessions, or even create programmable agents. None of those goals truly worked. Instead, many victims experienced lasting trauma, paranoia, and psychological damage. But here's the problem. Much of the evidence was destroyed before investigations began, meaning the full scale of the program may never be known. The Tuskegee syphilis study. It sounds impossible today, but one medical experiment continued for decades while doctors deliberately withheld treatment from patients. Starting in 1932, hundreds of African-American men with syphilis were told they were receiving free healthcare. In reality, researchers wanted to observe how the disease naturally progressed. Even after penicillin became the standard cure during the 1940s, many participants were intentionally denied the medication. Families remained unaware, infections spread, and preventable deaths continued for years. This is where it gets worse. Some wives became infected, and children were born with congenital syphilis because treatment was intentionally withheld. The study only ended after a whistleblower exposed the truth to the public. The scandal permanently damaged trust between many communities and the medical establishment. It also reshaped research ethics, forcing governments to require informed consent and independent oversight before human experiments could move forward. Operation Sea Spray. One ordinary morning in 1950, residents of San Francisco had no reason to suspect anything unusual in the air. Yet a U.S. Navy ship offshore released massive clouds of bacteria across the city to study how biological weapons might spread. Officials believed the bacteria were harmless and wanted to test America's vulnerability to an attack. Millions of people unknowingly became part of the experiment simply by breathing. Most experienced nothing unusual, but several people developed rare infections, and at least one death was later linked to exposure. The real danger is that no one had agreed to participate. Researchers collected data while an entire city unknowingly served as the laboratory. The experiment raised serious questions about where governments should draw the line between national security and public safety. Even today, debates continue over whether such risks could ever be justified under any circumstances. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Sometimes the darkest experiments reveal terrifying truths without using drugs or weapons. In 1971, researchers transformed a university basement into a mock prison. Healthy college students were randomly assigned to become guards or prisoners. The goal seemed simple: study how people behaved inside prison environments. But within days, everything spiraled out of control. Guards became increasingly cruel, inventing humiliating punishments and psychological abuse. Prisoners showed signs of severe stress, emotional breakdowns, and helplessness. The experiment was scheduled to last 2 weeks but ended after only 6 days because conditions became too disturbing. But here's the problem. Critics later argued that researchers influenced participant behavior and failed to stop the abuse sooner. Whether or not every conclusion remains valid, one lesson still stands. Ordinary people can quickly adopt shocking behavior when authority, environment, and social pressure combine in powerful ways. Operation Midnight Climax. If MK Ultra sounded disturbing, this secret project pushed ethical boundaries even further. During the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA secretly operated apartments disguised as brothels. Sex workers were paid to lure unsuspecting men inside, where hidden cameras recorded everything. Without warning, some visitors were secretly given LSD while agents observed their reactions from behind one-way mirrors. Researchers hoped to discover whether drugs could weaken resistance during interrogation or reveal hidden information. Instead, they mostly collected bizarre and unpredictable behavior. This is where it gets stranger. Some agents reportedly treated the operation almost like entertainment, watching hours of footage while drinking cocktails behind the hidden walls. The secrecy lasted for years before the public learned what had happened. The experiment became another example of how fear during the Cold War encouraged agencies to ignore basic ethical limits in pursuit of impossible goals. Soviet sleep experiments. One of the internet's most famous horror stories claims Soviet scientists locked prisoners inside a sealed chamber and forced them to stay awake for weeks using experimental gas. According to the story, participants descended into madness, mutilated themselves, and eventually begged never to sleep again. It is horrifying, memorable, and almost certainly fictional. No credible historical evidence supports the tale, and historians have never found records confirming the events. Yet millions continue sharing it as if it actually happened. The real lesson is even more fascinating. Governments have performed genuine sleep deprivation research because lack of sleep dramatically affects memory, judgment, and decision-making. Severe sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive collapse. That scientific truth makes fictional stories feel believable. Sometimes the scariest myths spread because they borrow just enough real science to convince our brains they could actually be true. Radiation experiments. During the race to understand nuclear technology, some government-sponsored studies crossed lines that would never be accepted today. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, certain hospital patients, soldiers, and civilians were exposed to radioactive materials without fully understanding the risks. Researchers wanted to measure how radiation moved through the body or affected long-term health. In some cases, radioactive substances were injected directly into patients who believed they were receiving ordinary treatment. Others stood near nuclear tests to study battlefield conditions. The real danger is that radiation damage often appears years later, making its consequences difficult to recognize immediately. Public outrage eventually forced investigations that revealed decades of hidden research. These discoveries transformed safety standards surrounding nuclear science and reinforced the principle that scientific progress cannot come at the cost of uninformed human lives. Unit 731. Perhaps the darkest government experiment ever uncovered took place during World War II under Japan's secret military research program known as Unit 731. Hidden behind strict secrecy, scientists conducted horrifying experiments on prisoners of war and civilians. Victims were deliberately infected with deadly diseases, exposed to extreme temperatures, deprived of food and water, and subjected to surgeries without anesthesia. Researchers wanted to understand how biological weapons and battlefield injuries affected the human body. This is where it becomes almost unimaginable. Entire villages were reportedly targeted during biological weapon field tests, spreading plague and other diseases beyond laboratory walls. After the war, many records disappeared, and several researchers avoided prosecution after reportedly providing valuable scientific data to foreign governments. The legacy of Unit 731 remains one of history's darkest reminders that when secrecy, war, and unchecked power collide, science can become one of humanity's most dangerous weapons instead of one of its greatest achievements.